All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Last Week in America. My name is Blake Center, and I'm glad to be back with you this week to discuss American culture as well as current events. So whether you joined us last time or whether this is your first time with us at the American Center, we're delighted to be with you. But we're also curious because last time we ended our discussion, we spoke about going to the movies, and a number of us were making plans to go to the movie theater for the first time in a long time. So in the chat, if you're with us, go ahead and let me know. Did you go to the movies? And if so, what did you see and how was it? And I'll go ahead and get my presentation started. All right, so looking forward to hearing your responses in the chat. But we'll go ahead and get started. I saw an interesting story in the news this past week about Puerto Rico. And it's quite interesting because Puerto Rico has the highest rate of COVID-19 vaccination in the United States. In fact, nationally, about 58% of the United States is vaccinated. However, over 73% of Puerto Rico is vaccinated. So such a high rate of vaccination places Puerto Rico on par with states in the Northeast, in the New England area, maybe Massachusetts or Connecticut, or out west, thinking of maybe Oregon or Washington. This is quite interesting because first, why we have to ask, why is this? And of course, there are a few reasons. First is because Puerto Rico, as you might know, was especially vulnerable to COVID-19 because just 4 years ago, Hurricane Maria, inflicted significant damage on Puerto Rico, its healthcare system, its businesses, and even its power grid. So it's no surprise that Puerto Rico implemented some pretty significant mitigatory steps and strict public health regulations with everything from mask mandates to vaccine requirements, et cetera. But plenty of continental states, that is what you might generally think of as the United States, implemented similar measures. So why is Puerto Rico's vaccination rate so high and its transmission rate so low? As you'd likely know, many groups in the continental US are fighting pretty energetically against vaccine mandates and mask requirements and other public health regulations. I'm sure that this resonates with many of you viewing our program in Russia, because I've heard word of many Russian citizens trying to avoid getting the Sputnik V vaccine with some pretty crazy measures, even some going so far as to use, prosthetic arms to avoid actually getting the vaccine in their real arm, which is a bit crazy, but crazy stuff going on in the United States too. But here, resistance to vaccine recommendations and mask mandates is generally speaking a Republican practice. But to be sure, there are Americans from all political parties and even some who don't identify with any political parties who've resisted various public health recommendations. And they argue, perhaps rightly, that these regulations or complying with the regulations would diminish their personal freedoms. But regardless, Puerto Rico does not have the same correlation between resistance to this public health guidance and political ideology. That may be the most interesting point. Of course, it's not to say that the guidance has not at times been politicized or controversial in Puerto Rico. It has been. But the politicization and controversy has not referred to political ideologies or to identity. So we can say that Puerto Rico has enjoyed higher vaccination rates than the mainland United States because it has a different political culture. But this is quite an interesting conclusion because you might ask, how could Puerto Rico have a different political culture than the continental states, like the I'm in right now, in the state of Georgia, or the neighboring states like South Carolina or Florida? Why is it different? Because after all, uh, Puerto Rico is part of the United States, right? But this deserves some discussion because not many foreigners and perhaps even fewer Americans actually understand the relationship of Puerto Rico and other territories to the United States. So first, a question. If Puerto Rico isn't a state, then what is it? If you feel comfortable writing it in the chat, let me know. And just to let you know, if it's any consolation, most Americans couldn't answer this accurately. It's quite a confusing phenomenon within our political set and our territories. So let me know in the chat if you have any ideas. But take a look at this map as well. On here, you can see the continental United States, but you can also see these various territories. The green ones, such as Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, etc., are inhabited or populated territories. And then there are other territories colored in orange that are uninhabited, and then others which are disputed. So it's funny because I included this in the presentation because just last week, I was having a conversation with my Russian tutor at MGU, and she brought up the subject of American statehood. And she casually mentioned that America consists of 52 states. That's 52 states. This is, of course, not true, but again, hey, most Americans have no idea how many federal subjects Russia has. So no big deal. But I asked her curiously why she said 52 states. And eventually we got around to her saying that she thought Puerto Rico and American Samoa were full-fledged states. But this begs an interesting puzzle because, again, most Americans don't understand the status of these lands. So how do we understand these places' status within the United States of America? And the answer is that, of course, there are 50 states and that Hawaii is the newest state. It gained statehood in 1959. So since 1959, there have been no new states, and perhaps there won't be new states anytime soon, though there are movements now to make Washington, D.C. a state. So perhaps D.C. will become the 51st state in the near future, but it seems unlikely at this time. But while there are 50 states, there are also various territories. And we'll focus on the 5 populated territories. These include, as you can see here, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the US Virgin Islands. These are all beautiful places. And maybe even some of you have vacationed there, but they're stunningly beautiful. But to show you how strange this territory phenomenon is, let's consider a few things. First, US citizenship is granted at birth in all of these territories except American Samoa. So if you're born in Puerto Rico, you're born as an American citizen. But interestingly, if you're born in American Samoa, you are not automatically a US citizen. But Samoans are still considered US nationals, which is an interesting distinction. And this is true regardless of whether they eventually gain US citizenship or not. And another strange dimension to this is taxation and military service. After all, in Puerto Rico, for example, Puerto Ricans pay federal taxes to the United States government, and many Puerto Ricans even serve proudly and nobly in the US military. But representation, political representation, is perhaps the strangest element relating to the territories, because each of these territories elects someone to the US House of Representatives. And here on the right side of our screen, we see a photo of Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett, and she represents the US Virgin Islands. But Representative Plaskett, like other congresswomen who represent the territories cannot vote on legislation that's brought to the floor. Of course, Representative Plaskett has an office, she has funding, and can even debate issues with her colleagues, but she can't vote, which seems like a pretty critical deficit of authorities. So this is actually not unlike the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., and its representation in Congress. Like the territories, D.C. has no representation in the Senate, only the House of Representatives. And the DC representative also can't vote. So with that hashed out, I think maybe it'd be interesting in your free time if you look up the US territories just to see some photos of them. They're quite beautiful and very worth visiting someday. But even still, there remain interesting and politically sensitive questions about representation, what's allowed and what's not allowed at the political level. But moving on to a perhaps a slightly more interesting subject for some of you. Tell me in the chat before we get started on this next subject, do you use social media? And if so, which platforms do you use? I know a lot of Russians are active on VK, but maybe you also use Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, or something else, maybe Instagram. So let me know in the chat. And also, if you're comfortable letting me know, tell me whether you use social media to express your opinions on political or social issues, or whether you think that that sort of content should be kept in your personal life rather than on your sort of internet personality on social media. So answer these questions in the chat, and we will discuss a very interesting development over the past couple of weeks in the United States. So, as some of you may know, various social media platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, have banned former President Donald Trump. Now, this is not the appropriate forum for us to discuss whether these actions are good or bad, but we can discuss what President Trump is doing in response and how Americans feel about his response. So he's announced the creation of a social media platform called Truth Social. And Trump is branding this service as a response to his and others' claims that big tech, to include Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and others, that it is essentially working to silence conservative voices. And of course, a number of conservative personalities, political personalities, and pundits or commentators such as Ben Shapiro have enjoyed tremendous success, and not least because of their social media presence. But nevertheless, Trump and his supporters genuinely understand Truth Social as a platform that would not remove users, or that is, deplatform users, or otherwise be hostile to pro-Trump users. And this is picking up steam because Truth Social will release its beta or its trial version next month in November, with a wider, potentially full rollout early next year. But you can understand maybe why this has been so controversial. And it's quite interesting because after January 6th and the storming of the US Capitol, President Trump's accounts were removed from various social media platforms. But his supporters began to see the media that deplatformed Trump as becoming, we could say, increasingly unreliable. A number of these Americans who had already distrusted the major or traditional news media, then grew suspicious of also social media. So these Americans argued that platforms such as Twitter were removing posts or suspending or deleting users' accounts because they were ostensibly violating the platform's terms of use. But as you probably saw in the news, this phenomenon became quite political, with some users arguing that they weren't actually removed because they violated the platform's terms of use, but instead they argued they were removed because their views express support for President Trump or otherwise held political beliefs that were deemed to be at odds with some kind of loosely defined social media establishment. And this is not a judgment, it's just a description. Anyway, many of these same Americans began using alternative social media platforms. And there arose this very interesting kind of social media underground scene where Trump supporters and others who were sympathetic to their cause for whatever reasons went to express their beliefs. And these beliefs they felt could no longer be expressed on more popular or conventional social media platforms like Twitter. So all of this is to say that Trump's creation of Truth Social is responding to a genuine demand among a segment, and perhaps a large segment, of social media users. In fact, some analysts speculate that the service, at the same time, could be used as a kind of megaphone for President Trump, because after all, he's been deplatformed from the more prominent social media platforms. So that is, although Trump is removed from Twitter and other platforms, he could use Truth Social to express his support for political candidates in the 2022 midterm elections and also the 2024 presidential election, especially if he himself announces his own candidacy. And the most interesting part of this is just how popular Truth Social is expected to be among the users that we were just talking about, the people who are suspicious of social media's reliability. Interestingly, polls show that over 60% of Republicans plan to use Truth Social. But for the reasons we've discussed, the service is likely to remain controversial for some time, especially as popular opinion remains polarized on the subject. But let's move on to a slightly more lighthearted subject, because I'm curious, very generally, if you could go to space, would you, and why? And this is something I dreamt about when I was a little kid, being an astronaut. And I'm curious if some others of you would like to go to space, because it's so strange. When we were children, although we had in the US and in Russia tremendous capabilities to travel to space, these were experiences that were limited to extremely high trained astronauts and scientists. This was something that was kind of out of reach for what we might consider to be relatively normal people. What a crazy idea to go to space. So it's interesting now that we see this picture here. It's I suppose a CGI, a computer generated image of a SpaceX aircraft. SpaceX, of course, owned by Elon Musk. And a number of these commercial space flight companies and space exploration companies are gaining steam in the United States. So let me know in the chat, if you could go to space, would you, and why would you like to go? Maybe you'd be too afraid to go to space. I can't blame you there. But regardless, there has been an interesting story that's gotten global press, but that's been especially exciting in the United States. So I had to include this bit of news because some stories are just so crazy. It's so unlikely that they, it's like they convince you that we're living in a simulation, or that, reality itself is somehow configuring itself in more novel ways over time. So many of you may be Star Trek fans, or have at least heard of Star Trek. And you may know that Captain Kirk was the fictional character who served as the captain of the U.S. USS Starship Enterprise. But William Shatner, pictured here, is the character who played Captain Kirk. And wouldn't you know, Captain Kirk has actually gone to space, but this time in real life. So 2 weeks ago, one of Amazon founder Jeff Bezos' companies, Blue Origin, successfully flew William Shatner and these other astronauts to space. This was Blue Origin's second commercial flight, safely conducted. And this made William Shatner, at 90 years old, the oldest person to ever fly to space. And I highly encourage you to look up videos of Shatner and his crew members reacting to, looking down at Earth. It's very emotional. And Shatner, even someone who's a trained actor, who I think relishes being in the spotlight and being well spoken, he was blown away, and it seemed speechless at just how profound the sight of Earth was from space. So I encourage you to look up videos of that, as well as videos of Shatner once he got back to Earth. And there was a kind of press event where the Blue Origin space capsule that you see in this photo has returned, I believe, to somewhere in Texas is where they return these spacecraft. And Jeff Bezos, the CEO of the company, greets him and his crew, and Shatner is grabbing Bezos by the shoulders and saying, what you've given me is the most profound experience I've ever had. And it's very emotional. And there is this strong desire, I think, among people, Shatner and others, to kind of democratize space travel. There's a sense that not just the elites, but not everybody, of course, but a number of people should, in a perfect world, have access to space travel. And this is very, very interesting, because again, something that was just so unlikely a few years ago is now strangely within reach. And this is all the more interesting because there is some follow-on news to this, that Jeff Bezos, again, the owner of Blue Origin, announced that his company, along with Boeing and some other companies, that they would collaborate to build a private space station, and they'd call this the Orbital Reef. The Orbital Reef, and it will be as big as the International Space Station, which is quite crazy. This would, to my understanding, be the first private space station of its kind. So perhaps you could say that these developments portend a very bright future for commercial space travel. At least thinking in terms of investments, analysts are projecting that it will be that is, the commercial space industry will be a $1.4 trillion market by 2030. So in under a decade, we're talking about a $1.4 trillion market. So investors are excited, and Americans, everyday Americans, are excited for these challenges and opportunities. I'm sure that a number of adventurous Americans might even book their tickets once they're available. What's so interesting about this is there is this brand of, we could call it extreme tourism, where more adventurous types might pay to climb and maybe summit Mount Everest. Well, it's an interesting hypothetical to consider. What if, in a slightly lesser degree, that commercial space travel could become the next form of this extreme tourism? Again, very interesting. So let me see in the chat. Maybe some of you are interested in flying to space. Let's see. So Vladman says, if I were a space traveler, I would travel to other planets and take photos there. I agree, very interesting, especially because you hear folks like Elon Musk, the CEO of SpaceX and Tesla, saying that we could colonize Mars. If you haven't seen videos of him talking about this, you should certainly look it up on your preferred video platform, because again, just such a strange and exciting opportunity. The idea would be that life on Earth could be unsustainable in the long term, and that you would need human colonies on other nearby planets, such as Mars, to sustain human life. So colonizing Mars might look something like creating a kind of greenhouse effect through various forms of, structures that you could build on the planet. And by, you could essentially, within that greenhouse zone, engineer an atmosphere that would support human life, animal life. You could grow crops on Mars. So again, very interesting. And perhaps these private and international government space stations will play a role in supporting that mission, as if they're kind of like a highway stop on the way to a travel destination between Earth and another planet. But if Vladman goes, he will be taking pictures of all of this, so we can thank him for that. Andrew says, I would go to space. It's a very important alternative to find a new planet for living of people on Earth. Agree. I think your comment actually preceded my own on Elon Musk. But yes, I totally agree. Let's see. Alexander says, I'm aware I wouldn't qualify, but if I'm given the chance to travel to space, I could attempt to see Earth from outer space. Yeah, of course. Again, a very interesting proposal to have that view of Earth. Seeing the video of William Shatner and of course other people who've been to space for the first time, it's as if they look at Earth as if they've seen God. There's such a profound emotional experience on these people's lives. It must be something that changes you forever, or at least makes you consider some very deep philosophical questions about life on Earth, humanity's place in the universe, and the meaning of life, etc. So let's see, maybe there are some other comments in here. Vlad says that he would definitely travel to space. It's so beautiful. And to think that other galaxies are out there is just amazing. Dimitri agrees, he would go too. Grapefruit Orange is commenting, I remember you from last week. Welcome back. I thought about it, and I would definitely not want to go to space. I'm afraid of flying as it is. I don't blame you. Yeah, you're certainly not alone. There are plenty of people who would certainly not venture to outer space, or would even be afraid to fly in an airplane. Looking back to some of the comments on social media, looks like we have a high number of users of Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and of course VK. But a number of you expressed that you try to avoid making political statements that could be controversial on social media, maybe in the same way that you avoid religious topics. I don't blame you there. It's a funny thing, because making this sort of controversial commentary on social media is somehow different than making it person to person without social media. Because when you can, maybe to say hide behind a screen is too strong to say, but when you're doing this sort of removed from other people, you're not looking at someone in the eyes, you're not seeing how they react, you're not really apprehending their humanity, you're communicating with, through electric currents, in a sort of dehumanized platform in a strange way. People could be insensitive. They might not realize how their views are actually affecting other people. And I think these comments could be especially incendiary on social media, just as, making similar comments on a text message between friends could be more incendiary, because again, it's harder to gauge things like sarcasm. It's hard to tell when someone's joking with you over text. So you get a lot of nuance in human to human interaction that is in person. But it's quite interesting because we need to express political opinions, and we need to express opinions that, although controversial, we believe in. It's important that we express these because that's how our societies develop and mature over time. But when you express these on social media, maybe there's a danger. Maybe there's a danger that social media platforms today are essentially serving what used to be the function of like a town square, where in a town or a village, people would gather around a certain point, and that would serve as a place in the community where people could not only buy goods and do business, but also to socialize and to talk about important issues, political and social. So maybe this is an area in which social media can improve, doing a better job of approximating that town square. And maybe there are opportunities for virtual reality to augment social media, to make it more like the sort of real human experience that you might get in a town square. But even still, an important forum for political and social commentary. Let's see, going through your comments once again. Looking back to some of the comments on Puerto Rico, which I should have seen earlier. Some people were thinking it's a city or maybe an insular territory, very close. Of course, yes, as someone rightly says, it's not a state, but still under the USA's federal jurisdiction. But yes, very, very interesting stuff. So glad we all chimed in on space. Oh, it looks like there are a few other comments. Vladman asks, you mean to create an artificial atmosphere on other planets? Without it, we wouldn't live there. Yes, of course. I know that there are a number of American entrepreneurs who are working daily on this, and even various aerospace companies that are engineering prototypical designs to create like extraterrestrial greenhouse systems where you could engineer an atmosphere on another planet. And Andrew mentions that he thinks it's a great idea to have a colony on Mars that has enough resources for permanent existence. So with that, let us move on to our last subject. But before we discuss it together, I'd like to ask you, will you celebrate Halloween this year? And if so, what will your costume be? I know actually very little about how Halloween is celebrated in Russia. So in the chat, tell me about whether you've celebrated Halloween before, or if so, how you've celebrated it, how you might think it'd be different than in the United States, because I'd love to learn more from you. This is one of those things, not unlike Columbus Day, that I think Americans rightly or wrongly take for granted as being an American phenomenon, celebrating Halloween. So I'm trying to gauge how weird an explanation of Halloween might seem to someone who's never celebrated it. So let's dive in, but let me know in the chat. So here we have a photo of President Obama and his wife celebrating Halloween with a number of kids who visited the White House, and they're doing what's called trick-or-treating. But as I understand it, in Russia, celebrating Halloween is not unheard of, but it's also not all that common. I can especially appreciate that the Orthodox Church may see it as a holiday that could in some ways contradict the faith. But I understand that despite that, the celebration of Halloween in Russia is becoming more popular, especially as some clubs and bars are hosting, kind of themed parties and with costumes, scary music, special menus, things of that nature. But in America, celebrating Halloween is a very well-established tradition. And despite the pagan trappings and associations of Halloween, I understand that it's technically connected to the Western Christian tradition. So maybe that's one reason why it's less popular in Orthodox civilization or Orthodox countries. But of course, in contemporary American practice, Halloween is observed as a secular holiday. It has, no, you could say, no conscious religious significance to anyone celebrating it. But I'm sure that you're all somewhat familiar with the way it works in America, but maybe not. So it's mainly a holiday for children and young adults. And of course, kids get very excited when Halloween arrives on October 31st every year, because they get to carve pumpkins. And in these pumpkins, they light candles. And, they call these jack-o'-lanterns. They carve scary faces into these pumpkins and light them up, and they'll display them around neighborhoods and homes and windowsills, etc. But the kids get most excited because they get to dress up in these costumes. And this is often, a costume that's fantasy related or scary. So, and also often pretty well gendered. So a boy might dress up as a pirate or a soldier or a superhero. You see one boy here in the photo dressed as Spider-Man. And a girl might dress as, a cat or a princess or something similar. But kids get very excited to dress up in these costumes. And the tradition is that typically around their neighborhoods, they will kind of roam from house to house, whether with their siblings or their parents or just their friends. And they'll knock on their neighbors' doors or ring the doorbell, and they'll say trick or treat. And then the person of the home inevitably will come to the door with a big bag or a big bowl of candy, chocolates and other kinds of sweets. And we'll invite the children to help themselves before they go to the next house. So then the children, some greedier than others, will load up their bags with candy and then make for the next house. Oh, let's see, there are some comments in here. So let's see, Grapefruit Orange says, I don't celebrate Halloween, but not because, like a lot of Russians, I think it's a satanic holiday, but because I think it's too commercialized. Interesting. Besides, all of those plastic decorations and costumes smell kind of disgusting. You're certainly not wrong there. Highly commercialized holiday, as many Western holidays have become. Vladman asks or mentions, perhaps I should ask my friends about it. Dimitri says, I won't celebrate it. Alexander says, I don't do that myself, but here we just tend to buy something printed, not more than that. The church doesn't have that much of an influence in this respect. It's more about commercialization. It's very interesting, this theme of commercialization. I wasn't expecting those comments, but very interesting. Andrew adds that in general, it is interesting, but I have no experience of participating in Halloween. Yelena adds, for me, it's purely a foreign holiday. I know that some language schools celebrate it, and nightclubs, although it's becoming increasingly popular, kids especially like it. For sure. But as you mentioned, it's popular in some language schools, some bars and nightclubs. So it's not just popular among younger children. In fact, Halloween is also very popular among young adults. Of course, they don't go trick or treating with their parents, but they do a lot of other activities that are quite festive. So they'll find occasion to throw costume parties with their friends, especially at American colleges and often in cities where there are higher concentrations of young people. And some of you, as you mentioned, have probably celebrated or know people who've celebrated Halloween this way in Russia. But if you haven't, then I highly recommend you at least give it a try if you visit the United States for Halloween. It would, if nothing else, be an interesting experience. I can say that, interestingly enough, I spent one Halloween partly it was in Washington, D.C., but in a Russian venue. Is like a Russian nightclub. So it was an American Halloween among Russians who I think were largely unfamiliar with the concept of Halloween. So it was this strange effort for people who weren't familiar with it so much to try to stylize, their version of American Halloween. So it was very interesting. Probably the best costumes I've ever seen, for what it's worth. And as I understand it, a number of Slavic countries celebrate, forgive my pronunciation if this is incorrect, but Kolyada or Kolyada. So let me know in the chat. I understand that Kolyada is more so associated with the maybe the Christian calendar, and is understood more in the context of, leading up to Christmas. But I'm curious if you see similarities between this holiday and Halloween. It'd be interesting to note, not least because it would seem strange that there is a similar kind of celebration across cultures. And interesting question is to ask, well, why are there variations in celebrating this holiday across cultures? But Vladman mentions that, of course, on that holiday, you can share not only candy, but also cookies, fruits, and toys. That almost sounds a bit better. Very cool. Now tell me in the chat, is it popular to celebrate Kolyada? Let me know, because this is something that Americans know very little about. But Halloween, of course, is something that's on a massive scale. Everyone's aware of it. It's happening in every city in America. And I'm wondering if Kolyada is as widely celebrated in Russia or maybe in Ukraine or Belarus. So let me know. And while you're letting me know, since this is our last subject, let me know if you have any questions before we finish our discussion. I'll be glad to stay with you and answer them. But in the meantime, I'll go through the chat while you're typing to me. Going back through this, yes, lots of comments on Puerto Rico, on social media, on Halloween, but also some comments to the initial question of going to the movies. Vlad is commenting again on Dune. I believe you mentioned that a couple of weeks ago. Says that you and your friend didn't quite get most of it. Yeah, Dune seems to have a pretty sci-fi heavy, convoluted plot, but it looks like this latest production was very well done. I know that it's getting a lot of press. Unfortunately, some people didn't make it to the movies. I hope you can soon if you are hoping to. Let's see, a lot of good guesses as to what Puerto Rico's status was. Very impressive. Oh, Kolyada, of course, Kolyada. Thank you, Vladman, for correcting my pronunciation. I saw it differently because there are songs on Kolyada. And, when you're listening to song lyrics, sometimes the emphasis is changed somewhat. So I couldn't figure out which was the correct pronunciation. But now I have it from an authoritative source. So thank you very much, Vladman. Yelena says, yes, going around to other houses, singing songs. widely popular at Christmas time. So it does seem that there is a significant area of overlap between Kolyada and Halloween. But nonetheless, very interesting. I hope that whether you plan to celebrate Halloween or later, I suppose early next year, Kolyada, very much hope you enjoy yourselves. Last comment here is from Grapefruit Orange, who says, I think that the growing popularity of Halloween is down to people being increasingly and unexplainably attracted to everything gory and horrifying. For example, most new movies on Netflix are horrors. That is very strange. Yes, I've noticed that a number of the new movies on Netflix are horror films, and this is not just a seasonal phenomenon, but it does seem like there are a lot of violent and scary movies that are popular on streaming services these days. But interesting insight there, Grapefruit Orange. So seeing that there are no further questions or comments in the chat, I'd like to go ahead and thank you all on behalf of the American Center for joining us today. We hope to see you during our next discussion, which our communications team will publicize in the coming days. So please feel free to invite your friends. I'd love to see you again, as well as any new folks that you might want to bring around. So thanks again. Have a nice weekend and happy Halloween. Bye-bye.